Cheers for coming down. This is the first event in a series of events Bristol Rally Distribute doing over the next 3 weeks, which is called the 70s, Life Before Thatcher. But so there's a whole load of different stuff. It's mainly about industrial struggles and stuff like that. There's other stuff about punk rock, the Asian youth movement, all sorts of stuff in there. Glam punk, disco inferno, whatever you fancy. So if you get a flyer afterwards, if you want to find out what's going on. And there's also some people here as well. We can be involved in organising it. You can chat to you if you want. So this is the first event. I just come out of a meeting a few months ago where we were talking about where we like to do stuff on sport. And obviously we were thinking about the 70s, and quite a few names came up, like Brian Clough, for example. But very quickly, the cricketers in our group, there's quite a few of us, said, well, 1976 West Indies tour to Britain was like really, really important at the time. And so we've got a film, which we'll show in a minute. We've got one film, which is a BBC documentary about the tour. And I've got a shorter film, which this is about half an hour, this film. And there's another film after that, about 5 minutes, about the Notting Hill Carnival in 1976 and the uprising that happened there. So I'm just going to do a little talk. I wasn't meant to be talking tonight, but for various reasons, including the fact that Harry, who works here, had a stroke the other week, which is, though he's all right apparently. It's been a bit difficult to get a speaker, so I sort of did some research, and I'm just going to do a very short chat, which is basically to put 1976 in context. Now I was 11 at the time, and I definitely remember the cricket tour, and I definitely remember the Long Hot Summer, because everybody remembers it, and I also remember the Sex Pistols, but a lot of the other stuff I probably wasn't aware of at 11 years old, though some of it I was. So it's really important to understand the West Indies cricket tour to Britain in that summer, in the context of everything else that's going on in Britain at the time. So, for example, I'm just going to lay out some of the things that were going on that were in the consciousness, certainly of the British public, but also particularly the consciousness of black communities in Britain at the time. So yeah, Long Hot Summer, it's the hottest summer anyone can remember. There was like 10 days, I think, which broke all the records sometime in July. It was also, the early phases of the sort of punk rock scene appearing, like I think New Rose, which is the first punk rock single, probably came out in, September 1976 or October. So it was right. There was a lot of changes going on culturally in Britain as well at the same time, and there was also it was also probably the most feisty year in terms of like trouble on the streets that Britain had seen for some time, in terms of not outside of industrial disputes and stuff like that. And all this stuff is going on. I'll go into a bit more detail in a minute, but just to give you some idea, if you remember, does anyone know why June 16th is important? June 16th? Oh, no, June 16th?
Yeah.
You know.
What year?
You know, you just forgotten. That's June 16th.
What's that doing with the football match?
No, June 9th. That's June the 9th. Yeah, it was a friendly against Altrincham. No, June 16th is important. It's very important because it was like the start of the Soweto uprising in South Africa. And it's a sort of youth day. And basically, June 16th, there was like a mass walkout and strike by black South African students in the southwest township of Soweto. It was a mass strike, and it happened because, although obviously there was the struggle against apartheid going on, there was an armed struggle. Most of that was going on outside on the boundaries of South Africa. But right in the centre of the Soweto township, students walked out. They fundamentally walked out because they said we don't want to be taught in Afrikaans. Right? They were being forced to be taught in Afrikaans. That's the initial demand. Obviously, there was all sorts of other things that lay behind. Like thousands of students walked out of their schools of all ages, and they were basically gunned down by South African security forces. 23 people died on the first day. The hospitals were full of injured children. Effectively, most people remember the photographs at the time. But I was amazed when I was looking into it today that struggle went on. That's the way to uprising. But basically, the security forces killed over 500 people in that uprising. There was over 1,000, mainly young people, and children who were actually injured. And it was also around the time there was a lot of debate about sporting boycotts, which was really important in all sports basically, but particularly obviously rugby and cricket. And in 1970, I mean, this is put it in context now. In 1970, I think the sort of World Test authorities decided, the cricket authorities decided to bring a moratorium in against South Africa, and that happened. A lot of that was to do with the 1968 incident, which you've heard of. Do you know who Basil D'Oliveira is? Yeah. So Basil D'Oliveira was a coloured South African, who was born in South Africa, who was eligible to play for England, and they were touring South Africa in 1968, and D'Oliveira was picked in the side. Now, when he was in South Africa, he wasn't allowed to play for the main, he was obviously a great cricketer, but he wasn't allowed to play in the South African sides because there was apartheid. If you were a coloured or black person, you couldn't play in the national teams. So D'Oliveira was excluded when he was in South Africa. When he became eligible to play in Britain, the English Cricket Board and Wales Cricket Board selected him to play in that tour. And the South Africans basically said, we're not having it. We're not having a black player or a coloured player playing for England in South Africa, right? Who is a South African, because of the apartheid rules. That caused a big scandal. Eventually, the English team didn't go to South Africa, and after that, in 1970, there was a kind of sort of semi-ban brought in. Although we all know in the sort of 70s and 80s there were various rebel tours and players who went out to play in South Africa. So that was all kind of bubbling around that was still bubbling on in the mid-70s, obviously. And it was because it was how many sports would get involved in it, rugby and other sports like the Commonwealth Games and things like that, which some nations boycotted if South Africa went to the Commonwealth Games. So there was a whole debate was going on at that time about sporting boycotts, about apartheid, and then the uprising kicks off right in the middle of the cricket tour, right kind of fairly near the start of the tour. So that was all in the news. There was I would say probably you could mark that year as being the rise electorally of the National Front, and they started to actually get significant numbers of votes around that time. They had earlier successes, but they were getting more powerful on the streets. They were also becoming more electorally powerful at the time. And there'd been significant violence prior to 1976 with the National Front. For example, in 1974, the National Front sort of marched near Conway Hall, I think, which is, you may know of a guy called Kevin Gately, who was an anti-fascist demonstrator, who was killed by the police. So there'd been attempts to stop the rise of the National Front, but by 1976 they were gaining a lot of support. And what is really important is also to recognise that the way the National Front worked at the time, its interest was obviously to gain power politically, but what it was really interested in doing was uniting sections of the right wing of the Conservative Party and driving forward anti-immigration policy. And you could argue that most British governments, even if they were Labour or Conservative, particularly the Labour Party, interestingly, when it was in power in the 70s and also in the 60s, basically buckled a lot of the time under this sort of pressure to stop immigration. So they brought in more and more repressive immigration laws, 1971 and 1976 as well. And they brought in these more repressive immigration laws whilst at the same time bringing in things like the Race Relations Act. So they were kind of balancing it, supposedly. But they seemed to buckle, even under this right-wing pressure. The more pressure there was, populism. So every time the National Front would get a victory or get a significant number of votes in an election, like a by-election or whatever, they would kind of buckle under and bring in more repressive policies. So it was a particularly bad time if you were an immigrant to this country by the mid-70s in dealing with the way state repression. I mean, I won't go into all the horrible stories, but there's a lot of horrible stories about how those immigration laws were enacted both legally and illegally at the time by the authorities, say airports. I mean, for example, they were using internal body searches on to check that Asian women were virgins when they came into the country and things like that. It was appalling what was going on. And so 76 is kind of this crux point where a lot of this stuff is hitting the surface. A lot of people know about this information. It's coming out in the newspapers and it's being exposed. So particularly repressive time if you're an immigrant or if you've been a recent immigrant to the country. Also, you've got questions of policing as well. I mean, most people have heard of the SUS law, I guess. Have you heard of SUS law? So I think it's quite important to sort of separate, I think, the SUS law, which I'll explain in a minute, and stop and search, because they were kind of slightly different things, really. People sort of remember SUS and think it was stop and search, but it wasn't actually. What the SUS law was, which was used extensively around that time, and in fact, I've got some figures here. In 1975, the SUS law was used. There was about 12% of those who actually went to court were people from black communities. By the next year, it had gone up by a factor of 3.5. So 42% in 1976 of those people arrested under SUS were actually were black people. So it was like a sudden change between 1975 and 76. Now the SUS law comes from the 1824 Vagrancy Act, right? What it was brought in originally was to clear the streets of London of the poor, the homeless, the beggars, and get them off the streets. And the reason the law operated the way it did, which was basically you didn't actually commit a crime to be arrested and charged with it. You haven't actually done anything. It was literally begging and being on the streets. If you were on the street and you were loitering, you had nowhere to live or something, then they could just arrest you and do you under the Vagrancy Act. This, amazingly, was re-energised in the 70s by the police force in the state. And what they were doing was they were using this law to attack certain areas of cities. So it was kind of this idea of like kind of racial profiling or area policing, where they would take an area and decide, right, that is where we're going to apply SUS. That's where we're going to apply this law to this community, because basically we pretty much think we're going to get a lot of hits because most of them are criminals. So it's like criminalising areas. What it effectively meant was if you ran around in a street corner, cops could pull up, and if they believed that you were about to commit a crime, right, which could be that you were looking at somebody's handbag, or you might be looking at somebody in the street yard, you're going to mug them, then they could stop you, search you on the spot, but also arrest you, and actually charge you and convict you on the basis that you might be committing a crime. And to give you an idea, in 1976, 3,500 people were arrested under the SUS law. And interestingly, it's over the whole country. 3/4 of them were out of 3 cities, okay, which was London, Liverpool, and Manchester. So, you've got 3 cities in the country, and in those cities, particular areas, these 3,000 people, 3,500 people arrested, nearly 3,000 of them were nicked in basically 3 cities in the country, and pretty much in 2 or 3 areas in those cities. So it was clearly a directed policy, and it was hated because it was seen as a mechanism for getting black youth off the streets. That's what it was used for. And it comes out of a moral panic which happened in the early 70s, which was created by the newspapers. I mean, most people didn't know what the word mugging meant. It only came into the British sort of vocabulary around 1972 or 73, but there was a huge moral panic about mugging, which got blown up and used by the police as an excuse for going after black youth on the street. So SUS is really prevalent in 1976. Stop and search was just standard. That could be done anyway at the time. So it's good. It's good to separate them in your minds about stop and search and SUS. SUS is something where you can get nicked for doing nothing, basically. And 80% of those people who went to court were convicted as well, which is a very high figure. Right. That's the kind of situation. That's the kind of at the start of summer of '76. These are the things that are going on. There's a kind of a sort of simmering anger going on about the behaviour of particularly the Metropolitan Police in London, but in other police forces as well. The way they're selecting areas to police them on the basis of what they regard or their racial profiling. They're using repressive measures in the law which date back 150 years to do it. And at that stage, I think a lot of communities have kind of had enough in London, particularly in London, but also in Manchester and in Liverpool. And the West Indies tour starts. Now, I'm not going to say much because the film basically tells you, but this talk's called Make Them Grovel, which was what Tony Greig said at the start of the tour, the England captain. And you can imagine as a South African, a white South African, making these comments in the middle of all this stuff that's eventually going on in South Africa in a situation where it wasn't the cleverest thing to say. And I'm just going to let him show the film. and the carnival started on the 29th, so it's 2 weeks after. To give you an idea, I don't know if you know about Nottingham Carnival, I think we've been going for about 10 years by 1976, it started in the mid-60s, and it had grown every year. And there'd been, every carnival prior to that had been fairly peaceful. But for some reason, in the 1976 carnival, the police decided to commit 10 times as many police as normal to that carnival of 1976. So typically they would commit 300 cops to in the past, in 75, 74. So this time they put 3,000 police on the streets of Notting Hill, Ladbroke Grove, and Portobello Road. And consequently, or whatever, the carnival went ahead, but there was an incredible amount of tension, and this film was shown in a moment which sort of covers a bit of that. But it's just to put some facts behind it. So there's 3,000 cops on the streets, 10 times what they've ever put on the streets before. They also had attempted to ban the carnival. It's the first year that there'd been a kind of sort of battle between the people who were organising it and the authorities for some time. Originally, it wasn't given permission by the authorities in the 60s, but it just went ahead anyway. So by the mid-70s, the local authorities and the police were trying to ban it. And so you get to this sort of point in the summer of 76 where it kind of comes to a head, where the police basically make their commitment clear to stop by putting 3,000 cops on the streets. And there was significant violence, but not just for a few hours. It went on for 48 hours, for 2 days. And you'll see in the film in a minute. So it was 2 days of rioting, which broke out in the afternoon and carried on for days. And I didn't realise how big an event it actually was and how important it was. It's kind of, most what I knew about it came from sort of 3 young punks who happened to be at that carnival. Saw Mick Jones, Paul Simon, and Joe Strummer, who were at the carnival, and I think a few others as well from their mob. And they witnessed it, and obviously you get the song White Riot by The Clash comes out of that, and they put it on the back of the album. But I didn't realise, I thought I was just some kind of minor bit of trouble, but actually it wasn't. I mean, there were 350 coppers injured, of which like 120 were actually hospitalised. There were 60 people who were also hospitalised as well, so it was a major amount of violence at that do. And you'll see in the next bit of film, so I don't think they really cover it very well in the BBC documentary, but what's really interesting is the fact that is how it's perceived. Now I had a bit of ITN or BBC film from the news, and the news report doesn't show very much at all. All it shows is injured policemen talking about it afterwards, going, I was just there and I got hit by a brick and it was terrible and these people are running wild. But when you see this film, you'll see actually a bit more about what actually happened on the day, because effectively it was a police riot to begin with, which then was opposed by the crowd. So, and you'll see what happens. So you've got to put in the context, they try to ban it, they committed a huge amount of police to it, and then it kicks off, and you'll see what happens. So probably because you've not got it plugged in now, is that right?
Yes, it's still plugged into the DVD.
No, it's plugged in.
Definitely had it all over wrong. He's back on it again.
Should we have a 5-minute cigarette break?
Cigarette break.
Buy some books.
On that. Here we go.
Which kind of put this mood of here.
Go again.
Remember kind of thinking that this is kind of getting bigger. So I went with some mates to go to Carnival that year.
Right.
On August the 29th, the Notting Hill Carnival began. The local police chief decided to place more than 1,400 officers on the streets for the 2-day event.
When I drove in from Brixton, I couldn't believe it. This is not a Notting Hill Carnival. This is a police carnival. because it seemed like more police than anybody else.
In anticipation of trouble, they'd come down, kind of heavy-handed. There was a massive police presence, which kind of put this mood over the carnival that year.
1976 was the first year I remember kind of thinking that this is kind of getting bigger and we should go and investigate. So I went with some mates to go to Carnival that year. And there was this cordon of riot police. So I said, "Excuse me, officer, can we get through to get into the Carnival?" And he just turned around at me and he said, "Why do you want to join all the niggers?"
They were everywhere. Move! Kicking over stones. You'll have this conflict at the street corner between police who arrested some guy. So you'll be a scuffle. And then you'll hear comments afterwards. Them police for dead. For down the street, another conflict. A band with a flag wants to turn left. No.
BJ knows the route, and if BJ don't know what route she has to take, that's the route she has to take. You're not organizing the carnival.
We were being provoked, and I knew by Sunday that it was going to be a battle royale.
You could just feel that there was about to be war in Babylon.
That was the weird thing. People knew we were heading for major trouble, and no one knew how to pull out. No one knew how to stop that from happening.
On the evening of the second day, the smouldering resentment turned into violence.
It's funny, you're at a carnival, you're digging a sound system, you're grooving on the bass, you're smoking your spliff, and the next thing you know, you're hearing, "Ah!" There's 500 cops charging down the road with bin lids and truncheons.
I was at the Mangrove restaurant, and my children were there, and the police stormed the restaurant. And we locked the door, barricaded the walls, and they broke all the glass, shouting, "Come out here, come outside, you black cunts, come on." And my children were screaming.
It started off, I understand, with some young kind of black guys going around doing a bit of, thievery, but a very small group of them. And then there was a massive overreaction by the police, stormed in, start hitting anyone with batons who gets in the way, and those kids decided they weren't going to put up with it this time, and they fought back.
I was with a group of friends coming down Ladbroke Grove itself. We were just gobsmacked, amazed at the sight. It looked like a war zone, complete.
I was underneath the bridge at Acklam Road. I'm not going to apologise, but it was really exciting to then see the police running away down Portobello Road and for protection having to pick up dustbin bins.
We'd pick up a brick and a bottle and like, "Yeah, have some of this, you bastards," you know what I mean? So we were giving probably more than we got.
Young as I was, I knew why this was happening. It was payback time.
The streets of Notting Hill were sealed off, and rioting lasted for 48 hours. Hundreds were wounded, mostly police officers. The West Indian community emerged from the riots with a sense of pride. They had given the authorities a bloody nose, and a strong message that they would no longer be treated without respect.
There was a feeling of, at the end of Carnival, of victory.
To be honest, it was like a great weight being lifted off your shoulders. And I'm sorry for the people that got hurt and got caught up in the crossfire. But for us, it was extremely liberating. It's undeniable.
it put an end to that idea that you can just keep people in their place, that you can treat them very badly, you can be overtly racist towards them and expect them to put up with it.
We had become not only black, but part of the soil. Because when you fight for a place, there's something sacred about it.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting bit of film because it gives you a bit more idea about what actually happened. So they definitely, there was provoking of the crowd, and I think what's important. I mentioned earlier on about policing areas. This thing about racial profiling, and what happened on that. I think on the Carnival, having looked at some of the evidence, is that they basically profiled the Carnival. So they treated the Carnival like they would treat somewhere like Brixton or Moss Side or Toxteth or Liverpool 8. So they kind of profiled the Carnival. I mean, I disagree with the numbers. They probably committed 1,400 at the start. There 3,000 were committed to the whole event, probably after the trouble started. But they put a huge amount of police in the streets, profiled it, and then when they nicked some geezer with a pickpocket or something, and the crowd intervened. And you've got to put it in context as well. I mean, like in that period in the mid-70s, was the first time that people started to actually, particularly in black communities, to intervene on the street in when people were being arrested. So I mean, a copper talking about Bristol in the late 70s said in an inquiry, said, when I was in St Paul's and we nicked somebody or stopped and searched someone or did something for sus, we wouldn't be debating with them, we'd be debating with the street. And that's because the street would come out and say, what are you doing? So it was like the community would respond to like arrests or harassment. And what happened in the Notting Hill Carnival was precisely that. I think the police went in there, profiled the whole area, went and nicked a few people, and then people intervened and said, what are you nicking them for? And then when that happened, they escalated it. And then they broke out into violence, the police, and then they got a response, which put 120 of them in hospital, 300 injured or something like that. So it was a major event. It comes 2 weeks after the end of the tour, and I think Darker Tale's right, actually. I think it did have an impact, the sports tour, in a lot of different ways, but definitely in one way was to give people a sense of pride about what they could do. And they did. 76 is not, we talk about the riots in 1980 and all that, but I think 76 is an important year. I'm going to shut up. But I don't know whether, I know there's some people here in some of those test matches, and I said I'd pick him out, so I'm going to pick Dave out. So you were at a test match, weren't you? So what happened?
What, as a 10-year-old with no political consciousness
consciousness
whatsoever?
So it's about the cricket.
Coming from a small northern town where you could literally count the number of non-white people on one hand, probably, or maybe two fingers. I went to, I can't remember if it was either 2 days or 1 day of the old Trafford Test, and it was it was the day when Gordon Greenidge and Viv Richards smashed the English bowling all over the park. They both scored centuries, took the English bowling to pieces, and as a 10-year-old who was mad keen on cricket, it was phenomenal. Just watching these guys smash what was supposed to be a good English bowling attack all over the park. Absolutely took them to the cleaners, and I sent an email to Roger earlier, and kind of the day still stands out in my mind, mainly for the cricket, because like I said, I had no political consciousness whatsoever at the age of 10. Watching Viv Richards clipping balls off his legs that just flew miles, absolute miles, and leaning into shots where he cover drove, just the timing. And as anyone who likes cricket at all, it was just a joy to behold. And at the end of the day, seeing Michael Holding and my boyhood hero Andy Roberts coming into bowl to the English openers and peppering them and just causing them pain and misery. And Michael Holding commented on it there. He said, watching his own run-up at the time, it was absolutely poetic. Watching him run into bowl was just poetry in motion. Absolutely beautiful to watch, as anyone who likes cricket would tell you. I had the great good fortune to meet Andy Roberts later in my life and briefly talk to him about that when I was living and working in Southampton. That was the main memory for me, was the cricket. The other memory really was the crowd, because at the age of 10, like I said, I met many people who weren't white, and seeing a large section of the crowd, West Indies supporters, they had steel drums, they had whistles, it was lively, it was noisy, it was colourful, And that again was something that sticks in my mind because I'd never come across anything like this before. I don't know what lasting impression it had on me. I haven't got a clue. The cricket certainly did. But yeah, it's certainly something I remember.
You were at the Oval, weren't you?
I went to the second day of the Oval with my dad and my uncle, and all I remember was the ball went to the boundary nearly every shot.
They batted for 2 days.
Batted for 2 days, yeah. I think it was with Richard. I think it was Alvin Calais-Turan. I'm not sure. I can't remember now.
Amazing, yeah.
I think he hit 150 odd, but it was literally every shot went to the boundary, and the noise, yeah, it was phenomenal. Like, I was like 10 years old, 9, 10, and it was like, yeah, it was quite an experience. Like, and I can't actually remember many wickets going out. It was just a long, hot day, basically. So that's what I remember.
Yeah, I mean, my experience of it was I was knocking around in North London at the time. My dad worked with geezer who's married to a woman from Trinidad, so I remember the summer and the impact it had on me because we would just go, I was hanging around their house and all that, and I'd not, I wasn't brought up in a pretty white area, so I was knocking around with all these like black kiddies and that, and there'd be like parties going on. So the party would start in the afternoon and it would be just watching the cricket, which would be basically watching England getting demolished, right? And then you'd have a massive party and people would come round and there'd be a big party in the evening. That was a new experience for me, but I certainly got into it from watching it there. I mean, I was into cricket anyway, but I know me and Dick used to play cricket together a lot when we were kids, but we did have a kind of, I think one of our favourite players was Collis King after that, so Joel Garner, but certainly Vivian Richards all that. And I think it's interesting, if you watch the film, the amount of kiddies that you can see are in the crowds, even that run on the pitch, there's a lot of young white kids as well. And there's this kind of moment where everyone's going like, yeah, I want to be a part of that. I think that's how I don't know what you think, that's what I felt anyway when we were around that age anyway. Because I think when you're around that age of sort of 10, 11, 12, you're really getting into sport, and I think you look for stuff. And, they might have tried to demonise the West Indies, but it doesn't work like that when you're a kid, I don't think. I don't know if anybody else was on anything. No?
They got better as well.
I noticed how thin Viv Richards' bat was. Do you see how thin and slight the bat was compared to what the bat was?
They're like that.
It was like that thick.
I think I went to the West Indies in 83 or 84, something like that. And again, I think I watched Andy Roberts hit 60. And Joel Garner hit 50 or something, and they batted, and it was like 9 and 10 were smacking the ball all over, and they were better. They were brilliant. That's Malcolm Marshall was number 11. I think he got some runs as well, so they got better. Do you know what I mean? It was embarrassing,
So that's it, unless you want a little chat with Bill.
Yeah, Roger, there's one little thing. That little clip you showed at the end all about Notting Hill Carnival. I seem to remember because, what was it, a year after I was on my... It was on my final year at college. And I think a year after they had a documentary on it, on ITV. It was about an hour long.
Right.
That went through the history. So I saw some of the footage that was in that original documentary that I saw.
There's quite a lot of ITN footage of it.
Yeah, well that's where it came from, they put on a whole hour's worth footage with a bit of commentary and a few kind of talking heads.
Yeah, I mean,
don't know what it's called. I can't remember what it's called for the life of me because it was so bloody long ago.
Yeah, I only found that footage today, but what I think is interesting about it is how you remember it, because I mean, to me, trying to think, how do I remember it as a child and what was being said about it, and I should have shown you the other bit of footage which was actually shown on the news, and what they show on the news is quite different. I mean, it's all based around like the injured policemen. It's talking about, like how good they are, and it's really quite shocking when you see it. And then you realise when I looked at that today, I was like, well, I kind of know some stuff about it from reading about it, but when you actually see it, you sort of think, yeah, this makes sense now. It doesn't make sense as just like such a big riot out of nothing. Like, it doesn't make sense really. But it does make sense when you realise they had 10 times the number of police they normally had on the streets. And you've got to ask yourself why that was. Because that, most of the crowd
other things like, say, you mentioned the sus laws earlier on. I mean, they played a bit of Limp and Kwesi Johnson stuff in that. If you remember stuff like, say, Sonny's Letter, which was a tune all about the...
Yeah. Well, I think it's like why commit that many police? Expecting trouble is what they said.